His name wasn't on the list, but he came to remind everyone of something they'd forgotten. Real honor sometimes waits outside the gate. Subscribe and turn on notifications to be the first to hear our next stories. And most importantly, what would you have done? Share your thoughts in the comments because every story leaves a mark, and maybe yours starts here. You're not on the list, sir. And that patch looks like it was sewn by a kid. The young soldier didn't even look up. His voice was flat, automatic, like he'd said the same thing a dozen times already that morning. Daniel Kruger didn't budge. He stood tall, hat in hand, coat flapping slightly in the wind over his worn uniform. The fabric was faded, but the creases still held. On his right shoulder, there was a small, unevenly stitched patch. It read, Clara. His wife had sewn it just weeks before cancer took her. He'd never let anything else touch that sleeve since. One of the junior officers nearby gave a smirking comment. This is a private event, sir. Military funeral. You need clearance to get in. Daniel didn't respond. He simply reached up with his left hand to adjust the patch. His right hand couldn't move. It was a prosthetic, a silent reminder of a war he'd been forced to leave behind years ago. He took a single step back, stood just outside the gate, back straight, boots together, eyes locked on the flags fluttering beyond the iron bars. He wasn't here to interrupt. He came to say goodbye. The shadows around the gate stretched longer as the sun crept higher behind him. His leg ached from standing so long, but his posture didn't change. People in uniform passed by, none really noticing him. A few frowned. One or two hesitated, but no one approached. Inside, white chairs were filling up. The path was lined with American flags. Marines were rehearsing in silence. Daniel looked down at the old, worn badge clipped to his chest. It wasn't digital, just a cracked plastic ID laminated over a photo taken 2 decades ago. His name, his unit, his discharge status. He handed it again to the same young soldier. Sir, this isn't valid anymore. You're not on the list, the soldier repeated, cold and indifferent. I just came to say goodbye to a friend, Daniel said quietly. Name, General Adrian Torres. The soldier tapped a few times on his tablet. Relation to the deceased? None, but we served together 34 years ago. This time, the soldier looked up. His eyes flickered between discomfort and disinterest. I'm sorry, sir. No exceptions without proper clearance. Daniel gave a small nod. Understood, he said simply, and stepped back again. The wind picked up. The flag snapped louder now. His coat flared slightly, revealing a glimpse of his metal leg. He tucked it back in with one hand. One officer leaned to whisper something to another. They laughed. Daniel heard them, but didn't react. He just kept his eyes fixed through the bars. The ceremony was about to start under the white canopy. He'd been to ceremonies like this before, but this time wasn't about pomp or protocol. Inside that tent lay a man who had once bled beside him. Adrian. That night in Basra, lying in a pool of blood, he'd whispered, Don't let them bury me alone. Daniel had carried that promise for 34 years. A group of young soldiers approached, energy drinks in hand, laughing carelessly. One looked at Daniel and snickered. Hey, who let Grandpa out of the museum? They all chuckled. One pointed at the patch on Daniel's shoulder. What's that? A souvenir. Daniel said nothing. He just adjusted his collar, then clasped his hands behind his back. His left hand was flesh, his right, cold metal. And he stood, still as a statue, proud. The sun was fully up now, the shadows sharp. Inside, the first notes of the national anthem began to play. Even from that distance, it made your spine straighten. Daniel didn't move, not during the salute, not even when the first rifle shot cracked through the sky. As the national anthem echoed in the wind, Daniel Kruger squinted toward the ceremony. The white chairs inside had all been filled. Officers, generals, and civilian guests sat in neat rows. But none of them noticed the old soldier standing just outside the gate. Maybe they didn't want to, because seeing something sometimes means having to act. In the sunlight, his uniform looked even more faded. But the small, unevenly stitched patch that read Clara, that was the one thing time hadn't touched. No matter how worn it got, every thread held Clara's love. He placed his hand gently over the patch, just like he used to hold hers after being wounded, just like on those dark nights when only her voice could help him sleep. The young soldiers came back, walking with the same loose steps, laughing and joking. One of them, the same one who smirked earlier, stepped toward Daniel again. his tone a little more curious now, but still smug. "Hey," he said. "Margaret, sorry, Clara, right? She your wife?" Daniel didn't answer. The kid stepped closer. "She make that patch? Looks like it was cut from an old pillowcase or something." The others chuckled. Maybe they didn't mean harm, but there was no respect either. And sometimes, a lack of respect stings more than insults. The young guy reached out with 2 fingers, lightly tapping the patch like it was some novelty badge. In that moment, the fabric shifted. Daniel's hand came up, not fast, not harsh, just slowly, with purpose, and covered the patch. Then he lifted his eyes and looked straight into the soldiers. There was no anger in his stare, no sadness, just an unshakable strength. It was the look of a man who once carried his commander through enemy fire, who gave orders while bleeding out on the battlefield. The young man backed off. His smirk faded. The others fell silent too. The laughter vanished. Shame crept in. One officer nearby had seen what happened. He turned his head and buried it in his papers. Because if he acknowledged it, he'd have to do something. A voice crackled over the microphone inside. Someone was reading a eulogy. But to Daniel, the story being told wasn't just about Adrian Torres. It was about the years they'd shared, sweating through the same brutal deployments, standing guard together at the same camp. He could still hear Adrian's voice from that night. Inside a shattered Humvee, bullets flying. "Don't you dare come back for me." But Daniel had come back. Because Clara had once told him, long before, "Don't leave anyone behind." His legs screaming from the strain, Daniel slowly sat back against the stone wall behind him. The pain in his knees was unbearable now. He placed his hat beside him. When his metal leg touched the concrete, it made a dull metallic clink. He took a deep breath. Heavy, slow. Then he reached up to his shoulder patch. With shaking fingers but steady resolve, he carefully removed it. He laid the small piece of cloth on his knee, flattened it like it was something sacred, smoothed the wrinkles, looked at the letters. CLARA. The stitches were crooked. The letters didn't quite line up. But her hands had touched every thread. And this was how Daniel kept her alive. Right then, something shifted inside the tent. A man near the stage was staring at him. His uniform was pristine. Bronze stars gleamed on his chest. He didn't speak, but his silence carried the weight of a command. It was General Marcus Stein, the only one who knew Adrian Torres' final request. And now, his eyes had found Daniel. Without saying a word, he handed his ceremony folder to his aide. He took off his gloves. The crowd went still. The ceremony had stopped. And suddenly, everyone turned to look at Daniel Kruger. The crowd shifted slightly. Cameras turned. The event staff looked at each other, clearly confused because no one had expected General Marcus Stein to step down from the podium and walk away from the center of the ceremony. But he was walking. Slow, deliberate steps. Each crunch of his boots on the grass could be heard. The metals on his chest shimmered in the wind, but his eyes were locked on just one man, Daniel Kruger. As the distance closed between them, whispers spread through the crowd. Some people stood, others lowered their phones. The top-ranking officer at the ceremony was walking towards someone completely alone. Everyone was trying to understand what was happening, but Daniel already knew. Because Adrian, that night, inside a flipped-over vehicle near the edge of Basra, as his breath grew shallow, had whispered, "If I don't make it, don't let me be alone. But whoever comes for me, it has to be you." Stein finally reached him. He didn't salute. He didn't speak at first. He just looked, not at the uniform but at the history behind it. And after a few seconds, he broke the silence. "I didn't think you'd come," he said quietly. Daniel's brow furrowed slightly. "Not showing up. While he's here, that would have been worse." Stein gave a slow nod. Then he turned and raised his hand. A young officer approached, carrying a polished box made of dark walnut wood. There were no markings on it. But Daniel didn't need any. He knew exactly what it was. General Adrian Torres' ashes. And now, they were going to be placed in the only hands meant to carry them. "This was his final order," Stein said. "He said only you were allowed. No one else. I was there when he wrote it." Daniel reached for the box. His fingers wrapped slowly around the wood. It was heavier than he expected. Not just ashes, it felt like the full weight of their past. Daniel's voice cracked. "I thought I'd been forgotten." Stein stepped back. "You weren't. Not ever." Then he stepped beside him. "When you're ready, we'll walk together." At that moment, the gates opened. The ceremony staff stepped aside. The general and the retired soldier shoulder to shoulder began walking. With Adrian Torres's ashes in Daniel's arms, they stepped onto the grass. The ceremony fell silent. The band stopped. All speeches paused, and everyone rose to their feet. Some didn't know who Daniel was, but they understood what this walk meant. He wasn't walking because of an order. He was walking because of a promise, a sacred vow made from one man to another. Daniel's steps were slow but steady. He had a slight limp. His metal leg clicked with each step, and he clutched the wooden box tightly to his chest. Stein walked right beside him, never ahead, never behind. Side by side, on the edge of the path, the young soldiers who'd laughed earlier were now silent, lined up straight, eyes forward, and one of them, the one who had touched the patch, who had mocked Clara's name, stepped forward. As Daniel passed, the young man spoke, barely more than a whisper. "Sir, I'm sorry." Daniel didn't stop, but he dipped his head slightly in acknowledgement, because sometimes an apology could cover the deepest wound, and sometimes a single glance could carry more honor than any medal. They kept walking toward the platform in the center of the grass. The white canopy came closer. The folded flags were already in place. With every step, the silence grew deeper, heavier, more sacred. As Daniel stepped onto the platform, he held his breath. That box didn't just hold his friend, it held memories, youth, and the promise he'd made to Clara. He quickened his pace, and then he placed the box gently on top of the flag, stepped back, lowered his head, removed his hat. There were no claps, no anthem played, only silence. But this time, the silence was holy. Under the canopy, Daniel Kruger stood still. His hands rested on the wooden box for one last moment. Then he pressed his hat to his chest, standing at attention. His eyes weren't closed, because they couldn't close anymore. They'd seen too much: war, peace, loss, betrayal, honor. And now, those eyes weren't just looking at the box. They were seeing every memory he'd carried for years, memories he'd never spoken of. Behind him stood General Marcus Stein, also motionless, but his gaze never left Daniel. Because this moment, this quiet scene, held a truth most people at the ceremony would never notice. Loyalty echoes, even in silence. The ceremony speaker stepped up to the mic, but no words came at first. He swallowed hard, then finally spoke. "The man standing before you wasn't supposed to be here. His name wasn't on the list. But maybe, out of all of us here today, his name belongs the most. Because he's the one carrying General Adrian Torres on his final journey. Because he's the kind of man who doesn't follow lists, he follows his conscience." From the back rows, someone stood up. An older man, near 70, wearing a simple jacket, but the pin on his chest told stories of another life. He spoke loudly and clearly. "That man saved my life too. In Basra, that night, when our convoy was burning, he was the one who pulled me out last." Another person stood, a woman, wearing a military uniform, gray hair, sharp eyes, but tears shining in them. "I didn't serve with him, but it's because of men like him that I'm here today. He's the silent hero of this ceremony." One voice followed another, and Daniel, for the first time in his life, stood still while others honored him. And he said nothing, because this time, his silence was the salute. At the end of the ceremony, the traditional gun salute rang out. 3 sharp cracks, then the slow, haunting sound of the trumpet. Taps. Each note rose like a farewell into the sky, a melody not just heard with the ears, but felt in the chest. Daniel stood the whole time. When General Stein came to him, his eyes were glassy. "Daniel," he said, softly but clearly, "everyone saw you today, but I've been carrying you for years." Daniel turned slightly. "What do you mean?" Stein didn't look away from the platform as he spoke. "That night, in Basra, you carried Adrian, yes, but you also pulled a second man from that burning convoy. You pulled me." Daniel froze. And suddenly, it came back. Yes, he'd carried someone else too. But the night had been full of smoke and chaos. He never saw the man's face. "It was you," he whispered. Stein nodded. "If it hadn't been for you, I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't have seen my daughter grow up. I wouldn't have held my granddaughter. And Adrian, he trusted you more than anyone. He gave this funeral to you because you never forgot him. He met countless people, earned countless titles, but he always spoke of you. He was always waiting for you." Daniel looked down at the grass, though now, it didn't feel like grass under his boots. It felt like memories. As the crowd slowly began to leave, the ceremony quietly ending, Daniel stayed by the platform. He had delivered the box. He had kept his word. And for the first time in years, he felt like he had finished a mission completely. Then, a few others approached. No medals, no uniforms, just older men in civilian clothes, but with backs straight and steps heavy with time. They weren't part of any official group, but it was clear. They carried the same weight Daniel did. One of them leaned on a cane as he approached. His legs trembled, but his eyes were sharp. "I know a handshake or a pat on the shoulder isn't enough," he said. "But still, welcome home, Kruger." And those words, finally filled Daniel's eyes. Because now he understood. This wasn't just a cemetery. This was the place where the unforgotten come home. As the ceremony ended, the white chairs were slowly being folded up. The military band packed away their instruments. Journalists zipped up camera bags. Protocol officers lowered microphones. But Daniel Kruger didn't notice any of it. He was still standing just a few steps away from where he'd said goodbye to Adrian Torres's ashes. He placed his hat back on his head, loosened his metal leg just slightly, then started walking without raising his head. General Stein followed a few steps behind. There was no command in his eyes, no curiosity, just quiet witness. Because some walks don't begin with orders. They begin with heart. They made their way toward the far end of the cemetery. It was quieter there. The noise of the ceremony had faded into the distance. The sky was covered in clouds, but there was no rain, just a cool hush. Finally, Daniel stopped. Beneath an oak tree, its branches had stretched wide over the years. The trunk had thickened. Its roots clung tight to the earth. But Daniel wasn't looking at the tree. He was focused on something just beneath it. A small bronze plaque, freshly placed. The soil around it was still unsettled. He knelt down. His metal knee touched the ground with a soft clink, but he didn't care. He lowered himself fully, resting on his left knee, and read the plaque. In memory of Master Sergeant Daniel Kruger and Clara Kruger, because honor isn't given. It's carried. Just a few words, but they hit Daniel like a blade to the chest. This was for him. No statue, no grand speech. And yet, it meant more. Because for the first time, the weight he had carried had a name, honor. He reached into his pocket. With trembling fingers, he pulled out a small piece of cloth. That old, faded patch. The one that said Clara. He brought it close to his face. And when he inhaled, it felt like he was breathing in not just air, but the past. That patch once held the imprint of her fingers. Now, it held only memory. Near the base of the oak tree, he dug gently into the soil with his hands. Not deep, because this wasn't about ceremony. Just a quiet goodbye. He placed the patch into the earth, covered it softly with soil, pressed it down with his palm, and whispered, "I'm burying you here, Clara, but not your love. That's still on my shoulder." Every morning, every wind, every step, he heard footsteps behind him. General Stein stood a step back. He didn't speak, because some moments deserve silence. But after a few seconds, as Daniel stood up, he asked, "Was that you? Did you do this?" Stein lowered his head slightly. Adrian's will included more than his ashes. He wrote that if you came, he wanted you to say goodbye to Clara, too. He made sure of that. I just carried out the order. Daniel didn't respond right away. He just looked at the tree. The leaves rustled lightly in the breeze. Like Clara was breathing from above. Like Adrian was whispering thank you from somewhere unseen. Then he turned to Stein. "I don't remember you," he said. "I didn't know I pulled you out that night." Stein gave a soft smile. "You weren't supposed to remember. But every morning when I look in the mirror, I see you. Everything I've had in life, my daughter, my grandson, it's all because of a single second of your courage." Daniel didn't look away. Maybe he didn't need those words anymore, but something inside him began to loosen. Not slowly, quietly, unraveling. Stein took a deep breath. This ceremony, this plaque, it was all meant to show you one thing. You were never forgotten. Not once. Because some men wear a uniform, but others carry a vow. And you were one of the ones who never let go of it. Daniel gave a small nod, adjusted his hat, then gently tapped his shoulder. "Well then," he said softly, "I guess it's time we head out." Stein nodded, but just as they turned to leave, Daniel glanced back one more time at the oak tree. His eyes were wet. His stance was strong. And he whispered, "I came, Clara. Now I can finally leave in peace." As Daniel Kruger walked away from the oak tree, his steps were slow but steady. There were no more missions, no more battles. But the weight he carried in his heart was still there, only now. He wasn't carrying it alone. General Marcus Stein walked just one step behind him. Neither of them spoke, because some silences speak louder than words. By the time they reached the ceremony area, most of the crowd had already gone. Only a few people still lingered, and among them was one who hadn't taken his eyes off Daniel the entire time, the young soldier who had mocked the patch that morning. Now, there was no smugness in his gaze, no arrogance, just respect. As Daniel passed him, the young man took a step forward and stopped. He raised a hand in a quiet salute. It wasn't official. It wasn't required. It was simply one human being honoring another. Daniel gave a small nod in return. No words were needed. The young man had understood. Some men walk with honor, and that kind of honor doesn't come from a uniform. As they neared the cemetery gates, a small group of people appeared. Most were older, dressed in civilian clothes, walking with canes, hair turned white. But their eyes had that same sharpness, the look of those who had fought life and lived to tell it. At first, Daniel didn't recognize them, until one of them smiled gently. An old team commander, someone Daniel once took orders from, and later helped carry when injured. "We couldn't find you all these years," the man said. "You just disappeared. But we always talked about you. Being here today, standing beside you, it's the right place to be." A woman beside him nodded. She wore a clean, pressed dress, but her eyes held military discipline. "We came for Clara, for you, and for Adrian." Daniel looked down. It took him a moment to speak through the knot in his throat. "I've thought about this for years. I lost my ranks, my papers, my rights. But I held on to one thing, my word, and my memories. I don't know if that's enough." The older man stepped closer. "It's more than enough. Because real honor isn't measured by medals or documents. It's measured by the moment you choose to come back when it matters most." Just then, another small group appeared from another corner of the cemetery. They were carrying flowers, clearly visiting another grave. But one little girl looked up at Daniel. She tugged on her grandmother's sleeve and whispered, "Who's that man?" Her grandmother replied, "He's a hero, but not the kind you read about in books. Some heroes save just one life, but that life can go on to build a world." Daniel didn't hear that, but somehow he felt it, because without turning his head, a soft smile formed on his face. And in that moment, everything became clear. Heroism isn't measured by applause. It shows up in silence, in the moments when you give up part of yourself for someone else. He stopped at the gate, paused without looking back, then lifted his hat slightly. The breeze caught the edge of his coat. Behind him, General Stein stood still, eyes fixed on Daniel. And in silent respect, he removed his hat, standing at attention. A moment later, Daniel began to walk. No one followed, because this walk was his alone, not toward a ceremony, not toward a farewell, but toward peace. And this time, as he walked away, people didn't just turn and look. They stood up, because when men like Daniel are finally understood, even if it takes a lifetime, they reach the place they always deserved. And even if the uniform fades, some men never do. Subscribe and turn on notifications to be the first to hear our next stories. And most importantly, what would you have done? Share your thoughts in the comments, because every story leaves a mark, and maybe yours starts here.